Hi, Lyle.
Hi there, Bob.
How you doing?
I am very well. Very nice to be with you.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for taking the time. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast, and you are Lyle Goldstein. You're currently visiting professor at the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs at Brown University. Before that, you taught for 20 years at the U.S. Naval War College, which is going to come in handy because I'm curious about how naval warfare might unfold in the event that the U.S. wound up in a war with China over Taiwan. Something that seems way more likely than it seemed 10 or 12 years ago, and somewhat more likely than it did only a few years ago. And I want to eventually get into that with you about why you think it's, if you agree, that it's become more likely, and in any event, what might be done to make it less likely, things like that. I also want to get into the relationship between China and Russia a little, because I know you're working on a book on that. And I think we'll probably have time to get into the Ukraine war a little, which is something I know you've thought about. So let me...
Bob, can I interrupt 1 second?
Sure.
Just so listeners know, I actually wear two hats. I'm at the Watson Institute at Brown University, as you suggested, but I'm also the director for Asia engagement at a think tank called Defense Priorities in Washington, D.C.
Okay, good. I didn't know that.
Sure.
I'm familiar with their work. They do a lot of good work. So let me start this in a slightly unusual way. This morning I was reading an excerpt from Michael Lewis's forthcoming book on Sam Bankman-Fried. And it turned out that Sam Bankman-Fried had a woman who headed up his public relations, and her parents lived in Taiwan. And the book talks about a time when Bankman-Fried had met privately with former President Bill Clinton and asked him what the United States might do if China invaded Taiwan. And then here's a quote from the book. Whatever Clinton had told Sam had prompted him to seek her out afterward and suggest that she move her parents out of Taiwan. Does that seem like reasonable advice given what you... and I know, there are a lot of question marks surrounding all this, but given what you surmise about the likelihood of war and how war might unfold, would you advise someone to do that?
I would. That's a very interesting quote, Bob. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. And, that shows a little bit of insiders thinking about this. And of course, that was presumably back in the 90s. So it's
well, no, Clinton was former president at this point.
Okay. Oh, I understand.
So the conversation probably happened a couple of years ago.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, look, it's pretty clear that we have a very dicey situation, and let's talk through all the parameters. But I mean, I myself feel that the island is in very grave danger, and the people on it especially. And to my estimate, it's unfortunately it's quite likely, or let's put it this way, it is certainly possible that Taiwan looks something like Ukraine, or even much worse. In other words, the devastation could be total, in fact, if it came to war. So, I'm definitely doing everything I can to head off this catastrophe. But yeah, I mean, the kind of fine point of that, if you will, of Clinton's observation and the subsequent action, it does seem to imply that, and I think quite correctly, that in a way this is out of our hands, Bob, as Americans. It's just too far away. The political currents that are driving this crisis are, I think, poorly understood by Americans generally, and even the American leaders. And so, to my estimate, we ought to be ultra cautious and design all our policies accordingly, and advise, we all have many friends in Taiwan, or many of us do, and they need to act cautiously as well. That's really the best way to prevent this.
Okay. And just before we get into how war might unfold, to give a little background, traditionally the U.S. has had this policy of strategic ambiguity. We don't say we wouldn't come to Taiwan's aid if China invaded. We don't say we would. And Biden has, in effect, departed from that by saying on 3 separate occasions when asked, yes, we would come to their aid. And then people in the White House kind of try to walk that back and say the policy hasn't changed. But certainly this has changed the rhetorical atmosphere at a minimum. I mean, and let me just stop there. Do you take this to be, in fact, an actual change of policy, and even maybe, an intentional one, or what do you think is going on there?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you will, in a way, it's the most ideal situation for policymakers in some respects, because anything goes with ambiguity. You can throw very hardline signals, or you can switch gears and say nothing has changed, and give very cautious advice. It all can swirl in this cloud of ambiguity. And worse than that, Bob, I think this betrays an unwillingness of American leaders to confront the real issues. Never mind. I don't want to have to make a hard decision now. I certainly don't want to set anything in motion, and I don't want to put these hard issues before the American people, so forth. So I think. And add to that, of course, this could unfold, as we'll discuss, I think, in any one of several ways. So, of course, strategically, I guess at some level, there's a desire to always maximize flexibility, right? But generally, look, at the end of the day, I myself am in favor of strategic ambiguity. Partly because I'm very strongly against a move toward, quote, strategic clarity, which I think would be extremely dangerous and might indeed start the war that we are hoping to avoid here.
Well, do you think, first of all, I take it do you think Biden has intentionally moved towards strategic clarity, or he just 3 times answered off the cuff in a reflexive way, and our policy hasn't really changed?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think people are leaning in that direction, but they're, afraid to people on the inside, let's say. I imagine there's a lot of debate going on between hawks and doves, and Biden sort of has probably listened to these debates and kind of, let's face it. I mean no disrespect in saying this to our current president, but I think he's a politician, an American politician who, of course, if he understands nothing else, he understands American politics and how Americans think, and what will how to get reelected and so forth. So and that generally favors a more hawkish or a kind of strength, if you will. So yeah, he's leaning in that direction. Those are his kind of gut instincts, I think we could say that are coming out in these little statements. Some have had kind of some caveats around them, and some have been sort of walked back. But yes, we're getting a kind of creeping movement away from strategic ambiguity and towards strategic clarity. I think that's a very fundamental mistake, and I myself am not. I don't support any of these statements that the president made.
Okay, so as for how war might unfold, now there have been a certain number of war games. Most of those, I think, are classified, and we might hear leaks about them. And in fact, there's one kind of famous leak where someone who was privy to some of these classified war games basically said, no matter how many times we do this war game, it doesn't work out well. Or I think the quote was, we get our asses handed to us or something. Now, I don't think. By the way,
that, if I could interrupt, Bob, that quote is from David Akmanik, who was an assistant secretary of defense, I think, and now I think is at Rand. But so that I think these kind of statements are not easily dismissed. But anyway, But yes, generally you're right. These have by and large been classified efforts, and I don't have really any exposure to those, and of course,
but there was.
I can't speak about anything that I did have exposure to. So I would
one was
hold on one
made
second.
public,
I would
right?
just say that. Sorry, I just want to emphasize here that what we do know about those classified war games is what has in those statements by Ochmonek
Right.
and others that have come out in the press subsequently, and I'm just reading the same ones that everybody else is reading there.
And then there was this thing done by I think the Center for Strategic and International Studies, right? Didn't they do a war game and actually release some of the results, or am I mixed up about that?
No, you're exactly right, Bob. And this is really important. I want to underline this twice for listeners that they should pick up this report. You can get it, the PDF for free online, the entire report. And that's very unusual in these kind of in this milieu. That's why I'm trying to draw attention to this report put together. The authors were Kansian, and Hagenbotham. There's a father-son combination there. And it came out in January 2023. So it's very up to date. It does, I think, have some real strengths that it provides, I think, if you will, the best fidelity look at what an actual amphibious invasion would look like. And it points out a lot of difficulties, including, huge losses on both sides. It points out the obvious, I think, point, but I'll just say it anyway, that Taiwan, unlike Ukraine, Ukraine could be reinforced and has been for more than a year, but that could not happen in a Taiwan scenario.
Because it's an island, you mean?
Exactly. Yeah, it can be cut off very, I would say, very easily, actually. But just to come back to this report, so I think that this is the most important study of a Taiwan scenario that has been published. Really, I guess I have to say that has ever been published. So that's again why I am asking, whatever your position on the issue, and if you care about U.S. national security and you're worried about this, please take a look at this.
So I gather the game didn't run like through the whole war, kind of. It was a limited, 48, 72 hour or something, like how it would unfold initially. But do you recall, roughly, okay, so what did they say would, according to this game, the simulation, happen within that time, that fairly brief time span? Like what kind of magnitude of destruction are we talking about, or what?
Okay, yeah, sure. I can kind of summarize quickly, although there are kind of the findings and then there are the recommendations, and we might want to discuss both, but let me stick to the findings for a minute. And, again, I would invite those people really interested in the report to ask the authors their assessment and get them, I don't want to put words in their mouth, if you will, but I'll give you my best summary. First of all, they're very clear that they're modeling, they call it the first battle. And it is, as you said, it's not the whole war. It's about, I think it's really covers the first month or 6 weeks, if you will. This is something that has to be borne in mind, that when we talk about the losses that I'm about to mention are not, did not cover the entire war. But another caveat that they put up front is that this models an amphibious invasion. So this is the all-out attack. And there are many other options available to the Chinese, including like blockade or limited attack. We can talk through some of those options. I've definitely spent a lot of time thinking about those. But as for the results, and everybody wants to know, what are the losses on the U.S. side? It goes without saying that the losses on the Chinese side are really devastating, amounting to hundreds of aircraft, hundreds of ships being lost. They say in the base case that the United States loses 270 aircraft and 17 ships. Does
it specify what kinds of ships? Are these some of them are aircraft carriers, presumably,
yes,
or?
Yes. Some of them are aircraft carriers. In fact, they do make a statement of something to the effect of, the 1 or 2 aircraft carriers that are in the vicinity of Taiwan when the war begins, and that's generally the case, would be destroyed in the first few moves. I think that's the first couple of days. So yes, I think it's fair to say the base case implies that we would lose a couple of carriers right off the bat. Now,
and this is all within like 2 days or something.
Well, no, the loss of 17 ships or 270 aircraft would be over 4 to 6 weeks. So yes, you could argue that, Bob, that this is part of the message here. From, if again, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but is that, they're in fact arguing that this is doable. I'm quite critical of that, and they have a pessimistic case where the U.S. loses something like 500 aircraft. Interestingly, they have us losing fewer ships in that case, so that they call that the pessimistic case. And then they also talk about something called, which is sort of a worst case for them, and now they posit that this is unlikely, but they say it is conceivable that the United States could lose up to 4 aircraft carriers, 43 surface ships, which would include 15 submarines. And they also, I'd have to review it, but at various times they say it's quite reasonable to expect we might lose more on the order of 700 or 800 aircraft. So, and that's, I think, not even incorporating Japanese losses. So, I think my general takeaway is that they seem to have made an argument that we could somehow get away with this war, and with sort of, if you will, tolerable losses. But I think that is a very optimistic case, and I actually think some of their assumptions are deeply flawed. For example, their estimates on our surface ship vulnerability. Now, they say our surface ships are very vulnerable and they expect to take serious losses. Like I said, at the minimum 24, but possibly more like a third or more of our Navy being lost at sea. So those would be pretty devastating. I think it could be worse. And I'm ready to elaborate if people say how I come to those conclusions.
Well, first, to just kind of summarize and be clear. So although they only did the simulation per se for a few days, they kind of extrapolated to total losses over the course of a number of weeks. And is the assumption that at that point the conflict would be resolved? We would have, quote, won?
Well, hold on. I just want to be clear. In my reading of it, is that they modeled something like 4 to 6 weeks, maybe even 8 weeks. They went through all the all the iterations, and a few times in the analysis they would say something like in the first few turns. Now that refers, I think, to the first few days.
Okay.
For instance, again, I'll just emphasize, they said we are likely to lose 1 or 2 aircraft carriers in those first few days. But
so I was confused. Thank you.
As far as ending the war, well, this is a very important point, and actually a very famous specialist, former CIA Lonnie Henley, stood up in the in when this report was rolled out and put it very clearly, I think, to the people presenting the report. He said, "Hey, look, you've modeled a battle here, but you have not modeled a war. This war doesn't end. You don't really talk about war termination." And I think they did agree. So these losses that I'm talking about, which I consider rather conservative, and they say even in the worst case, the United States could lose, a third of its Navy or a third of its combat aircraft. I mean, that's a kind of devastating loss. That might be in the first battle, but we're not talking about the war, and this war could continue for months, for years, or longer.
Tell me if I'm naive or about or just confused about Chinese politics. My assumption is there's no way they're going to put up with loss in the long run. I mean, even if the conflict subsided and they had to retrench and build up their military and come back in 3 years or something, it seems to me that it's just basically unacceptable in Chinese politics, whether at the elite level or grassroots level or whatever, for the leader to say, okay, we lost Taiwan, because of course, China considers Taiwan to be part of China. And the irony is that we kind of halfway do as well. We do not recognize it as a sovereign nation as Ukraine was recognized. And so too for much of the world. And we have a so-called one China policy in which we kind of acknowledge that they consider Taiwan part of China, and as long as they work it out peacefully, that's fine with us. So, for them, it's like, they would think of it as a civil war in a certain sense. And I do you agree with me that like they're just not going to accept defeat?
Yes, I emphatically agree with everything you just said. And this implies, you're exactly right. I've often said, if we fight a war with China over Taiwan, and even if we win, which we might, I don't rule that out. We might even win it handily, as this kind of CSIS report seems to suggest, at least in their best case. Well, yes, I think it's quite likely that China would redouble its efforts. Now, look, I think even the last major DoD assessment said China spends, I think, less than 2% of its GDP on its military. Well, that could easily triple or even go up higher to 10 or 12%. China could become fully militarized. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's conceivable even that President Xi Jinping would even like that option, right? He might get the China he's always wanted. That is, in effect, call this is sort of like the Russia scenario. China becomes a lot more like Russia. I mean, Russia is now kind of fully mobilized in certain ways, in a way that it wasn't 5 or 10 years ago, and now, and so I think that's a rather likely outcome. And yes, we would maybe see a first war over Taiwan, and then a second war over Taiwan, possibly a third war over Taiwan. Of course, any of these could go nuclear, but we may see larger and larger attempts, bloodier and bloodier, of course, for the people on Taiwan, but also for our side and the Chinese side too. These would be in scale somewhat similar to the world wars, and could have those kind of devastating losses. So, but Bob, I just want to again underline this twice. What you said exactly. For the Chinese, this is a civil war, and in a way, that's their ace in the hole. That this is that they, what we talk a lot about, certain asymmetries in capabilities, but here, what's critical to understand is the asymmetry in interest. To put it plainly, they care a lot more about this than we do, and than we ever will. And frankly, then we should. I'm, to my estimate, this is a small island off of China with some complex history. It is not, in my estimate, it is not the crucible on which we, should bank the future of U.S. national security. So I'm, I'm advising caution, even sort of extreme caution.
Yeah, and because Taiwan is not internationally recognized as a sovereign nation, we couldn't say that the same principle is at stake as is at stake in Ukraine, where Russia violated international law by invading a sovereign country. And the other contrast kind of implicit in what we've said, which I'd underscore and see if you agree with, is, people are talking about the possibility that Russia, if Ukraine were willing to do a ceasefire now, kind of settle for what they've got, which is not control of Ukraine. I mean, since the war started, they've actually taken a relatively small fraction of Ukraine. The country is still intact, and a lot of people read Russian politics as meaning that Putin would settle for a ceasefire that eventually hardened into something like whether it was a frozen conflict or formal settlement. Like, he could settle for what he's got. And I think you would agree that with Taiwan and China, that there's just no way that happens, right? I mean, it's just that they settle for something other than controlling Taiwan once they've started the war and we are engaged, right?
Correct. And I think that leads to, I at some point we might get into Ukraine in this conversation. I'm following it incredibly closely, but I have a series in the magazine Diplomat that looks at sort of the Chinese lessons that they're taking from this war. And it's a big deal because this is really well, I think the first major war of the 21st century. And of course, that has a lot of lessons to offer militaries around the world, including China and Taiwan, I should say. But one of those lessons, I think, that the Chinese are taking away from Russia's experience fighting in Ukraine is that you can't go halfway. You cannot sort of gradually build up, and you cannot. I think it's well known now that Putin's army, his original attack had, I think, something on the order of 150,000 troops. And, any military analyst could have said at the time, well, you couldn't even occupy the Ukrainian capital with that number. And of course, they didn't even come close. So, the point is the Chinese have seen this. They know that they will need, overwhelming odds. And they have them, to be honest, in almost all dimensions of military power. So, but yeah, you're exactly right. They will not. This is not a halfway proposition for them. You cannot kind of split this. Now, hold on. There's one caveat there. There are political off-ramps, political solutions, I think, to Taiwan's future. I mean, the most obvious one, which is one that I certainly support, is the idea of confederation, where Taiwan's sovereignty is limited in effect the way it is today, but it accepts the overall kind of one China overarching concept, and so I think there are political solutions like that. But once the bullets start flying, I rather doubt that China would retreat to accepting kind of such a position. But you'd be surprised how many ways there are to kind of, as it were, to split that apple. That is this notion of confederation, right? I mean, in fact, I really wish, as somebody who focuses on this a lot, that the editorial pages of our top newspapers were full of our best legal scholars and diplomats kind of thinking hard about how to find this diplomatic solution, which is there to be found, I think. We seem to have given up on it completely, but people forget that in 2015, at the end of 2015, the leader of Taiwan and the leader of China sat down and had a very amicable meeting in Singapore. That was a historic moment, but somehow it's been like completely forgotten. Why can't we get back to that point and start talking about, this confederation idea? It's totally workable, and it has the side benefit of preventing World War III.
Yeah, let me ask you about one thing that's quite distinctive about this situation, which is the chip factory, the TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company chip factory, which is the most sophisticated such factory in the world. There are the most advanced chips, as I understand it, can only be made there. And now Biden, some months ago, imposed some sanctions and not just U.S. unilateral sanctions, but he managed to kind of rope a lot of Western countries into respecting these sanctions, basically that prevent China from buying the most sophisticated chips that come out of the factory. Now, first of all, I would think that creates more upside to war for China, right? Like, if they're not getting the chips from that factory and the rest of the world is, and the initial stages of the war involved the destruction of the factory, they might view that as a win, right? I mean, because they're not getting the best fruits of that anyway. I mean, anyway, I would think it makes them less averse to the destruction of that factory than we are, because we're getting more out of it, and we're kind of using the output, the top line output, to put China at a relative disadvantage in AI research and so on. I'm curious what you think about that. I'm also curious as to whether that figured in this war game. Like, what happens to the factory? Did China not bomb the factory? I mean, I can't believe that if China was about to lose the war, as this game envisions, they wouldn't go ahead and bomb the factory. But you tell me about all this.
Okay, sure. Well, let me preface this by saying I'm not an expert on microchips. So I'm just reading what's in the press. And and thinking a little bit about the basics here. But look, my my overall take is that while this is worth discussing and certainly would have reverberations in the global economy, that I do not consider this to be a kind of make or break issue for the Chinese assessments. If the Chinese are going to push the button and attack Taiwan, it will not be because they need a microchips factory or something like that. I mean, my assessment generally on microchips is that if they haven't mastered everything they needed to already, they're on the way to achieving that kind of technological ability. Partly, by the way, that for I think for at least a decade, a lot of these TSMC and these types of people were circulating a lot in right. China, and being very well paid and well treated as a result. And I think some are still there. So I would say in general on the technology, I would say the cat is well out of the bag.
Ultimately, I think. By the way,
hold on. Yeah, well, go ahead. Sorry,
I was just going to say, I think one remaining kind of choke point is that apparently the machines that build these machines that make the chips or something, or the machines in the factory, some of the key machines can be made by only one company in the Netherlands, so for now, that's in Western hands, but I don't doubt that you're right that Biden's, if China wasn't already bent on attaining self-sufficiency in terms of being able to make the most sophisticated chips, the Biden sanctions have put them on that path, and I would guess it's a matter of some number of years before they have it. But anyway, that's just my.
Well, hold on. I mean, look. I said it wasn't like a driving factor in the scenario. China will not attack for that, as the primary purpose. But as a secondary goal or tertiary, I don't rule it out. I think it's occurred to them that they could gain a lot from Taiwan technology, including especially these chip factories and, of course, the people that go with them. I don't doubt that as part of the Chinese invasion plan that they, some airborne contingents land around the plant, secure it, try to, and I imagine they even have lists of the critical people that they would want involved, So I wouldn't surprise me if that's all part of the plan. By the way, I don't have any special knowledge here, but I have to believe that these factories might be on the target list for the United States, if you can believe it.
I think so.
In the first few days of a Chinese attack that the United States, and this may not be the only place in Taiwan that we would want to try to destroy so that the Chinese could not take it. So that's also kind of a worrisome angle on this. But and look, I do think the global economy would take an enormous hit if this war happened, for a variety of reasons, but also that reason. I think I would like to see our side, as we have, I think, try to build up our own indigenous chip making capability, but also kind of insulate our economy in other various ways. I guess you would call this de-risking. I mean, but there's simple things like I think there's a shocking amount of American medicine and medical devices are made in China. I mean, are we prepared to go without that for a decade? I mean, that could happen in this case. So, but generally, I just would say that the idea, some people on the other side of the debate say, "Oh, we absolutely have to defend Taiwan in order to prevent this calamity for the global economy." I disagree. I don't think. Look, there would be inflation would be bad and so forth, but I mean, we're not going to risk nuclear war with China, devastating losses to our armed forces, where we might lose a third of our Navy. We're not going to risk that kind of war to prevent, higher car prices or something like that. I mean, that to me is ridiculous.
Yeah. So could we talk a little more about how the war might unfold? I'm not just asking you to draw on that war game, but on any thinking you might have done about this. And I assume, by the way, that it's kind of hard to sketch out anything with much confidence. The reason I say that is that, like with Ukraine, it had been a long time since we had a big, major land war. A lot of technology had changed, and we've discovered that some of the assumptions we had going into it really don't hold. I mean, the effect of kind of pervasive drones is something I think they're just starting to come to terms with. Some people are saying, well, maybe in the age of drones, there's just kind of they inherently favor the defense. And for example, that's the kind of conjecture that's going on now that wasn't going on right before the war started, at least as far as I heard. I mean, so and similarly, it's been a long time since there was a big naval battle between two major powers, right? Like I'm trying to think, is it World War II or what? But with that as a caveat, I'm interested in your view on that, on whether there's just a lot of wild cards because the technology has evolved. But anyway, notwithstanding all that, I'd be curious as to how you even start thinking about how things unfold. Like what happens first? The amphibious ships come from China, we bomb them, and then what? Or I don't know.
Sure. Well, let me take this in a few pieces, if you don't mind. I mean, the first thing is, I mean, yeah, I would say that our understanding of modern war is kind of inherently flawed. I mean, frankly, it's always been that way. We're constantly fighting the last war. We're constantly surprised. As one of my mentors explained to us, I remember being in a classroom in graduate school, but this very wise point was made that imagine if surgeons conducted surgery every 30 or 40 years or something like that. I mean, surgeries are done every day, so they're sharpening their skills in that way. But this is really how militaries are, especially when we're talking about great power war. And so, yes, I think the last high intensity naval war, we'd have to say, was the Falklands. But even that, I would say that wasn't, extremely high intensity.
So that's 1983 or 82 or something.
Yeah. So, but that, of course, would not approximate the scale of the naval warfare that we're talking about in the Taiwan Strait. So, yeah, we really have to go back to sort of, 1944, 45 to find naval action on this kind of massive scale. And yes, so I come into this with a lot of humility, and I think we should hear all kind of points of view and examine all possibilities, and still be overly cautious, right? Because even if somebody says, "Oh yes, we have this gadget which will solve the whole problem," and by the way, that is kind of the American. That's seems to be in our American strategic DNA. The search for that gadget. Color me skeptical, and one of the major reasons is geography here, folks. Taiwan is 90 miles off Chinese shores, but many thousands of miles certainly from the continental United States. 8,000 miles or something. Although we have some outposts out there, but even Guam, for example, is not especially close to Taiwan. Not close enough for unrefueled fighter range, I think. But look. Maybe we can get into the nitty gritty here. I suggest maybe we take it in two pieces. I mean, one, I can kind of lay out the CSIS report. We talked about the findings there. I can go through my sort of critiques of their vision, but I have my own vision about how the war would unfold here, and that will actually drop from defense priorities, hopefully in 4 to 6 weeks. We're working on 5. Very detailed analyses that include the high intensity military scenario. So I definitely can give you a little bit of a preview here. But the last thing I'll say, and then we can get into nitty gritty here. But let me say, I think this could go in there kind of, I would say, kind of 4 basic scenarios, types of scenarios, and we can talk about each of them if you want. One is the all-out attack. That's the one CSIS focused on, and I have been focusing on that as well. And I think it's quite possible. But many China specialists, including strategists, dismiss that and say, look, there's no way that China would take these risks, nor would the United States. So there's just simply no way an all-out amphibious attack would occur. The economic cost would be immense and so forth. So they say, well, a blockade, however, is possible. So there's the blockade issue. I've studied that a lot. We could talk about that. Then there's another option, which is kind of a limited attack against one of the islands. And people tend to think about the 1950s because some of that did occur in the 1950s, but it could be larger in scale. For example, there's something called the Penghu Island Group that's just about 20 miles off of China's coast. Anyway, they could do a major landing on those or something like that. And then one more kind of step, let's say, down the escalation ladder would be a kind of almost was a little bit of what we've seen, just kind of a pressure campaign. It could be a bloody pressure campaign. They could unleash all their missiles and so forth, but just to engage in air and missile strikes or something like that, or use kind of cyber attacks. Anyway, putting kind of immense political pressure on the island to kind of sign up to whatever China demands. So those are kind of the four basic scenarios, if you will. But again, my focus and that of the CSIS study are on this kind of all-out attack. So shall I start there?
Sure.
All right. So let me run through a couple of just very quick critiques on the CSIS study, because again,
can you start by telling us like how the study sees it unfold? Well, like, was I right that like, okay, China starts moving amphibious landing vehicles in, and they support them with, I guess, fighter jets and drones or something, and we attack, right? I mean, that's the we attack their ships and their fight, right? With presumably mainly with well, I assume with a combination of air power from aircraft carriers. I don't know what we have in the way of drones, and artillery fire in effect from destroyers or something or other. I don't know what happens right there.
Yeah, I mean, let's see if I can paint a very quick picture of this. I mean, look, everybody agrees that if the Chinese go all out, that it will be a massive kind of aerial and missile attack supplemented by drones. I think everybody agrees on that. And how devastating it is. Well, I guess there is some disagreement. But here, for example, I completely agree with the CSIS authors' conclusions. They say that the Taiwan Air Force and Navy would be very quickly eliminated. And they don't, mince words there. They say, would be totally eliminated as a combat force. And that would happen relatively easily. Now, they do, they say that, yeah, I mean, they say China would make a variety of landings. This is the CSIS report. They say that they would, in almost all of their iterations. And by the way, they good on their methodology. They iterated this many times. As it were, they rolled the dice, because that's an important part of wargaming, and looked at different as it were, solutions where Taiwan or where China attacks, from the north, from the south, and so forth. They found that the Chinese were able to get a kind of lodgment, meaning they were able to secure, a certain part of the island where they could start bringing supplies. But they found that basically American forces, how did they engage? Because that was part of your question. They found that, interestingly, they found that surface forces, that is our surface navy, destroyers, cruisers, and the aircraft carrier battle groups, of course, were totally ineffectual. And frankly, I've been saying that for a long time, and that those forces would take immense losses. At one time, they even say that essentially every U.S. Surface ship in the Western Pacific was likely to be destroyed. I mean, that's a pretty astounding statement. They also, another interesting finding from the study, and a lot of this I applaud, because I think they're kind of bringing reality to us, although, again, I have several objections that I'll get into, but they say that our tactical aircraft, that is our fighter aircraft, are also kind of a non-factor. Why? Because the bases that they're flying from, whether Okinawa or Guam or maybe somewhere in the Philippines, get plastered. And, that's the problem with land-based aircraft is they need an airfield. They don't just need any airfield. They need
to be clear, the Philippines is immediately drawn into the war, in effect, in this scenario, because China bombs it, and Guam as well, which is
well, Guam is a U.S. territory.
That's like so China bombs U.S. territory. Okay.
True, and so that, to me as a strategist, frankly, I've been saying this for decades, that both fighter aircraft and surface ships would be, if not irrelevant, almost irrelevant, because they just cannot be supported and they're too vulnerable. Now, so what American forces are in the fight, and here, I do agree with the CSIS conclusion. They say our submarine force is really at the heart of our fight there. I think, I have my own estimates on the submarine force. I've worked very closely with submarine force over many years. A lot of my work at Naval War College had to do with undersea warfare, so I think I can speak to those issues. But and we do have a very strong submarine force, although it has its problems. But I think within 2 weeks we could have something like a dozen of our nuclear attack submarines operating. Okay, but
we should say to people, nuclear, if you don't know, refers to the way the submarines are powered, not to the missiles. They would be conventional torpedoes or whatever they are.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Although there is a nuclear weapons dimension to all this, but let's get to that later, I suppose.
Right.
But the other major U.S. force that could seemingly make a difference, at least in the eyes of the CSIS authors, and here I disagree a bit, is they really put a huge emphasis on our bombers and say our bombers they kind of alight on that, I must say, in a bit of a surprising way. I call it almost like a Strangelovian moment. If you know Dr. Strangelove, bombers have a big role in that. But I myself am very skeptical that bombers could, and then that's one of my differences. But an area that I agree on with the CSIS report is they do highlight the role of submarines, but they note that submarines probably cannot, if you will, be decisive. And that's because not only do we have sort of nowhere near the number of submarines, but here's the key, is a submarine is only as good as its weapons. And submarines have just an inherently small weapons payload, something in the order of 20 to 30 weapons total. And that includes, you can stack them either cruise missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, or torpedoes, but you can't have 30 of both. You have to,
And so how many submarines would we likely have in the area in any kind of near-term time frame?
Well, I don't have any special information on that, but I can suggest, it said something in the CSIS report hinted that we always have, it suggested that we have a pattern of having, a handful, maybe 3 or 4 submarines in the rough area. That is probably the area of the, so they might be usable on day one. And I, by the way, I could easily imagine that first meeting with a U.S. president where the national security advisor says, "Sir, we've got, this submarine, this U.S. submarine is ready to destroy, a Chinese cruiser or even a Chinese carrier. Just say the word and we're in." But I believe that kind of no war moment, Mr. President, are you ready to, would occur probably in the first 48 hours, precisely because of those submarines, because they're so good and so lethal. That may be very well the way that we enter the war. And by the way, I think China is pretty clear that they will not shoot first at the United States. I'm pretty convinced that they will not make a sort of devastating blow against U.S. forces to start the war. I think they would want the United States to shoot first. We can discuss all that. But hold on, one more point on this issue on submarines. First of all, they have very small magazines. And here's the problem, Bob. Not only do they, would they quote Winchester very quickly. Winchester means it talks of, this refers to the problem of a rifle that is hard to reload. And you're quickly out of ammunition. Oh, sorry, no, it was a Winchester repeating rifle. Sorry, I should know this better, but you could fire so easily that you easily run out of ammunition. So torpedoes, by the way, historically are not 100% effective either. So anyway, the problem, Bob, is these submarines have to go reload. Okay, they have to find a way, and reloading a submarine is very difficult. All right, these weapons are incredibly expensive and heavy, hard to move around. It's almost never done at sea, although the Germans tried it, by the way, in the Battle of the Atlantic.
So they probably go back to bases in Japan or something and
That's right.
reload?
They have to go back to these bases. Of course, the Chinese know exactly where those bases are, and the CSIS report rightly notes that those bases will be, among the first targets that China would hit with its missiles strikes to try to treat. But China has come a long way in their because they've been, for decades, I've been tracking their concern about U.S. submarines. So they're working very hard to develop proficient anti-submarine forces. I don't think they're nearly where they want to be, but just to give an example, they've noted, and I think it's correct, that the use of sea mines, especially used in quantity, that is very dangerous to to submarines. So that's a pretty strong counter. And I do believe they would seed both sides of the strait, the north and south of the strait, with mines to prevent U.S. submarines from entering the strait. And I think they would use them in other ways. So, what I'm saying is submarines are no silver bullet. I'm glad the CSIS report kind of recognizes that. They seem to claim that bombers are a silver bullet. I'm skeptical there too. I can go through the various arguments, but I mean, more or less, these are very, slow moving aircraft moving along a very predictable vector, by the way, firing subsonic munitions that are not particularly smart and, could also be shot down. I don't think,
And these are bombers, both coming off of aircraft carriers and some coming from mainland somewhere and being refueled or something?
No, I want to be very clear about this. I don't think there are any aircraft carriers anywhere near this. And then, the aircraft carriers, their aircraft simply don't have the range. And so it's very interesting.
You mean they don't have the fuel, even if we want to make our aircraft carriers a big part of this? Or
the only way that I think aircraft carriers plausibly could be involved if they're using like super long range drones. We don't have that capability right now. I mean, we've been kind of playing around with it, but right now, the attack capability on an aircraft carrier is really limited to, 500, 800 miles. I think with tanking, you can push that out a bit further. But again, these tankers are incredibly vulnerable, and 500 or 800 miles isn't nearly close enough to make a difference. Moreover, we're just not going to, I don't think we're, again, this is just guesswork on my part. I'm not read in and, on these things, but my view is that we would not risk the carriers. We know that carrier losses could be very severe, and therefore, we got 5,000 young Americans on these ships. We're not going to put those forward. That would be incredibly foolish. So I don't think we're that foolish, and we would play it more cautiously, put the submarines forward, and try to possibly turn the tide with bombers and submarines. But I don't see that as likely. And
so land-based bombers and submarines, to be clear.
And the bombers would be flying out of Hawaii and Alaska primarily, because Guam would probably have been turned into glass. I hate to say it. I mean, they might succeed in still conducting flight operations. I know they're putting a huge effort at missile defense in Guam, but China's going to put everything into destroying the basic Guam. And now, there are other efforts too underway. They're playing around at Tinian and many other islands out there. But I don't think the balance of forces favors us here, because China has plenty of munitions. Can I just make one more point here, Bob? And sorry to talk your ears off about the CSS game. And by the way, again, I have my own sort of vision about how this unfolds. We can get to that. But the biggest problem in the CSIS report is they assume somehow, I really don't know how they made this mistake, but they assume that the Chinese amphibious force amounts to less than 100 ships. That is a huge mistake. I think the amphibious force that is loaded on ships would be well over 1,000 vessels. That is not 100 like they project, but over 1,000. Possibly more like 5,000, and could be even as large as 10 or 15,000. I mean, China has the largest merchant marine, the largest Coast Guard, the largest fishing fleet. And by the way, fishing boats are pretty good for this, actually. They're very seaworthy, and they have, those, what do you call it? The apparatus for moving things around, a lot of storage space. And here's the thing. China regularly exercises with these, with a merchant fleet, with a fishing boat and so forth. In fact, Lonnie Henley, who I mentioned earlier, who's a great ex-CIA specialist on China, but he wrote a wonderful paper that was published by Naval War College in May 2022, where he said that civilian shipping and the militia would be the backbone of a Taiwan invasion. And he said, quote, not a stopgap, but rather China's preferred approach. So this assumption, why is this so important, Bob? Because the assumption in the CSIS game is you just have to destroy, 50 out of those 100 vessels and you win.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that's just complete bogus. And
it's off by an order of magnitude, it sounds like.
Or a few orders of magnitude.
Okay.
And, I think if China lost 50 ships in this invasion, they would dance in the streets. because those losses would be so minimal. They're prepared to take lose 500 vessels or more, and we just don't have anything like that kind of firepower to put 1,000 or 3,000 Chinese ships under the waves, and therefore, and that's where proximity is trumps here, and I think they know that, and that's why they're going to have a distributed attack. And I can lay out my vision a little bit, which is
well. Can different. You? So I'll tell you, we've been talking almost an hour, and what we generally do here is do that, for the public, the public podcast, and then we continue the conversation in an overtime session, and to watch or listen to that, you need to be a paid subscriber to the Nonzero newsletter. It's easy to do. Just Google Nonzero and Substack, or even look at the link in your in your smartphone app that you're using to listen to this. And we encourage people to do that if they value conversations like this, which I think it's safe to say you will not find on mainstream media. And then once you've done that, it's easy to set up your own podcast feed that will always have these bonus sections on it. You'll also get the paid the kind of paywalled written content in the newsletter. And Lyle, you've been kind enough to say you'll stick around for this. Before we make that transition, I just want to give you a chance to say anything about where people can find your work. I mean, what's your Twitter handle for starters? You're still on Twitter, right? As we used to call it.
That's right, Bob. I'm at Lyle Goldstein. And by the way, I just joined Twitter in 2021, so I'm quite new to it. But I am posting every day, and I spend a lot of time reading Chinese and also, by the way, Russian material that, again, you would never find in conventional Western media. So I think it's quite there will be things that unique items there, let's say. But I'm publishing. Please look out for these several explainers we're going to publish at Defense Priorities. I have a series in The Diplomat, and but I'm trying to get the word out on how dangerous, how truly dangerous this Taiwan scenario is. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and your listeners.
Okay. And with that said, and with, thanks to everyone who's listened this far, whether or not you continue with us. With that said, we will now move into overtime.